Hi, Adam.
Hey Dan, how's it going?
Not too bad. Welcome to this edition of Blogging Heads TV. I'm Dan Foster, news editor, National Review Online, and this is Adam Serwer, a writing fellow, if I'm not mistaken, and prominent blogger at American Prospect. And last time you and I had a dialogue, we talked about something that has been used in place of Ambien for a lot of even diehard political junkies.
Right.
And this time we're going to talk about something much more exciting, which is war.
Yeah.
Capital W, capital A, capital R. So I figured we'd start by just talking about the kind of the top of the fold today in the last few days in all the newspapers and all the websites, which is the intervention in Libya. And it's kind of a weird one because unlike Iraq, where the right and it was pretty much unified, it's probably 90-10 support for the intervention in Iraq. Maybe I'm being a little unfair to those who opposed it on the right. And then, the liberal hawks, especially those in Congress who supported it. This time around, not so much. There's a lot of division on both left and right. And on the right, there's kind of three camps as I see it. There's the old school, conservatives who think national defense means just that. We shouldn't be practicing adventurism abroad with the U.S. military. We shouldn't be risking blood and treasure to intervene in a civil war in a country that doesn't pose any direct threat to American national security. Then there's this camp that, and that first camp, those are the folks who were opposed to intervention in Iraq. The second camp were people who maybe supported intervention in Iraq, but have been chastened by the reality of that experience and are eager not to repeat the same mistakes this time around. And that's a pretty sizable camp, and I think a principled camp as well. And then the third camp of people who on the right who oppose this, at least, seems to be we were for intervention in Iraq, we're for intervention in Libya, but Obama has just messed this up. Mm-hmm. And a caricature of that position is that they would have thought that no matter how the president conducted this operation, that this is the wrong intervention because, in short, Obama sucks. So there are certainly some people who believe that. I don't think it's the predominant position among those who on the right who oppose this intervention, but there's certainly some folks who believe it. And on the left, I get the sense that a lot of folks just really aren't quite sure how they feel about it, or they have mixed feelings, or they're kind of sitting this one out, or So I mean.
Well, I think there's a couple of different people. I think there's, there are the people who think, we definitely should have gone in, and those are people like John Chait and, the sort of your usual liberal hawks. I think there are definitely people who think it was a close call, but there are people who, I think I'd put myself in the camp of, I think going in was probably a bad idea, but if we're going to go in, I actually think the way that the administration did it, I thought multilateral intervention was the way to go. I mean, I think there are people who recognize who recognize this as sort of, or who see it as sort of a hasty move that mimics, some of the recent ill-fated military interventions that the United States have been involved in. And I think there are people who just think that. Are often, in principle, opposed to military intervention, except in very limited circumstances. I think it's, it's sort of a hard, I think it's very difficult for people sometimes to say, I'm not in support of a military intervention that, in the words of the administration, would stop Srebrenica on steroids. I think for a lot of people, it's hard to say, well, I don't care if those people die, but I think, at least for me, I look at, from my point of view, one of the major strategic goals of the United States should be minimizing the amount of Muslim countries in which it is waging war. And obviously, opening up a third front in Libya is a real problem. And I think the worry is not, that we're going to end up with Iraq, but we're going to end up with something like Somalia, where in 2006 the Bush administration, backed an Ethiopian invasion, and we sort of, we ended up with putting the same people in charge who were in charge in the first place. Only this time they had less authority, and there was a violent splinter faction that turned into, Al-Shabaab, which is today an Al-Qaeda affiliate. I mean, that was just total blowback. And of course, Al-Shabaab is this group that has had sort of amazing success recruiting Americans. I mean, the first American suicide bomber ever was a member of Al-Shabaab. And I'm sure the Bush administration, when they went in there, weren't thinking, this is the result that's going to come from here. And when you intervene someplace like Libya, where I think the politics of Libya are extremely opaque to the United States, like I don't get the sense that we really understand all of the camps, who's down with who, what, in part because Libya, unlike someplace like Egypt, has really lacked for civil institutions in the same way. And you look at, you read stuff in the New York Times where it's like, the Libyan rebel army is sort of maybe 1,000 people strong, and 1,000 trained militarily trained soldiers strong, and there's just a sense that, I don't really know what's going to replace Gaddafi if he goes, and I don't think any of us know, and I think that's the reason. I think for me that's the big reason why I thought this was a bad idea. However, having said that, I think that it would have been an extremely bad idea to make this a unilateral American commitment. Especially given how strained our military resources are at the moment. But
I would agree with you broadly on the first point about the unwisdom of intervening in a civil war, the belligerence in which you're unfamiliar. I muddled my prepositions there, but in a civil war in which you don't know the horse you're backing. Mm-hmm. But I would disagree on the second point you made right there at the end about this being at least because it was multilateral. But on the first point where we agree, that's true, and I've noticed even just here and just talking to other commentators on the right about this, it's amazing how quickly you slip into bad habits. We like to think that even if we like someone like me who was kind of ambivalent. Irrelevant because I was in college at the time, but I was ambivalent about the Iraq War. I probably, to be fair, I broadly supported it. I was nervous about it, but I broadly supported it, and think that we have to see it through, for better or worse now. There's still a lot that you can learn tactically, strategically, politically, diplomatically, from all the things that we did wrong there, or that we did wrong for a long time before we got right, or that we're still doing wrong. And it's amazing how quickly I hear myself and I hear others slip into bad habits when talking about Libya and forget those lessons. We sit around. So just in background, I got lucky in the sense that I did not second guess the intervention in Libya. I first guessed it. I changed my mind. Unlike Newt Gingrich, I changed my mind about it before the first bomb was dropped. Mm-hmm. So early on, the first day there were reports that Gaddafi was using air power to just indiscriminately, attack civilians in the streets. I thought that, hey, this might be a case where we have to impose a no-fly zone with whoever will come along with us for the sole purpose of preventing him from using heavy weaponry to kill civilians. And I was in favor early on, three weeks ago, of that action, which will bring me to my second point about why I disagree on this multilateralism thing. But my thinking really changed the longer we waited, because at that point you had this confluence between a humanitarian imperative to prevent the slaughter of innocents at minimal, in the grand scheme of things, minimal cost in blood and treasure of the United States, and also this opportunity to undermine a regime that's been a thorn in our side for 30 years. But at the time, I was really just in favor of a limited no-fly zone that grounded his Air Force and limited or destroyed his ability to make war in that way. And then whatever material aid that happened to provide the rebels would be collateral. Now, whether it was a collateral benefit or collateral damage, who knows? Who's to say? But as the days and weeks went on, and then it became clear that the rebels were going to be, routed and basically couldn't survive without American intervention. That made the mission, I think, much more problematic, and so I kind of changed my mind and publicly so about the wisdom of doing anything. I thought it was, as I put it, too much, too late, the way we went in. And so, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to say I don't think that there was ever a chance that this was just going to be a no-fly zone, even if we had done it early. The fact is, like, the problems that we're seeing now would have been there regardless. The rebel army isn't huge. There isn't a coherent opposition leadership that's prepared to fill a power vacuum should Gaddafi be removed. There was never this. I don't think we were ever going to get a situation where there was just going to be a no-fly zone and, like, things were going to be okay from that point on. Like, I think that's the other problem is I think there's generally been not a lot of honesty from the administration on what the level of commitment is going to be from the international community on this. And they've insisted it's not a war, even as really it's escalating into what is a full-scale air war against the Gaddafi regime. And I think that's really problematic, and it's but for the reason that I didn't ever believe that it was just going to be a no-fly zone, I am glad that the U.S. Brought other people along, because I am concerned that we may end up holding the bag for this, and I just don't think we should have. I'm not sure. This is going to cost so much money, and it's going to strain a military that is already involved in two different countries. I just think that I don't know how we would have done this if we weren't doing it in cooperation with other people who, frankly, were far more eager to get into this fight than we were.
Well, I think that's right, and certainly if we're talking about Britain and France, and especially France, then yeah, we're in agreement. But the point I was going to make about why this is actually the way I look at it is actually perversely, this is an argument. The way this is unfolded is an argument in favor of the Bush Doctrine, and it was the way that the Iraq War was conducted that gave the Bush Doctrine a bad name. So the problem with the Bush Doctrine was how it was actually carried out. But to me, this is an example of unilateralism when necessary, multilateralism when possible, and certainly 3 weeks ago we could have gone in with Britain and France, who between the three of us. And maybe some other Commonwealth countries like Canada, who's also involved. We could have gone in with a much smaller version of the coalition of the willing. We could have done it much more quickly, and we would not have been wanting for resources to enforce this no-fly zone. And you would have saved a lot of time. I think the UN Security Council was a waste of time. I don't think it lended any more, legitimacy to this intervention than it would have had otherwise. And if you had done, and you say, these problems would have been here 3 weeks ago. That's right in a way, but at that point, I think you could have been seen to, whether this was the reality of our involvement or not, you could have been seen to have been intervening only to stop the slaughter of civilians. And then, if the end state there is a de facto partition or a U.S. protectorate, the way Kurdistan functioned in the 90s, well, so be it. You'd stop the bloodshed, and you'd kind of establish a truce line and prevent Gaddafi from. And that may be what happens now. But notice we have all these political problems now because the perception has changed over the last 3 weeks, and you have a lot of people saying that we now own the rebellion, and that furthermore, it will be seen as a failure if we fail to take out Gaddafi, and it'll be worse than had we done nothing. Whereas I think if you just, made a decisive move a few weeks ago to say this far, no farther, and and established, an arc around Benghazi and the east, and just prevented the advance of Gaddafi's forces, then there wouldn't have been this problem associated with, what happens if he stays, what happens if he's not ousted. I just think you would have avoided, and maybe it's mostly cosmetic, but we're talking about international relations here. A lot of it's cosmetic,
I have a couple questions for you.
Yeah.
So, I mean, again, I'd say that I don't think there was ever a possible way to do this quickly. Like, in terms of, I mean, this kind of stuff I don't think is ever quick. But as far as the international legitimacy question goes, I think sometimes people really underestimate the level of hostility there is towards the United States in terms of military intervention. Like, we live. I think it was Freddie DeBoer who pointed this out, but we live in a country where the concept of someone else bombing us is inconceivable. We would never ever consider that. And the rest of the world, particularly the Arab world, does not live like that. I mean, they do live with the possibility that someday the United States may come in and decide that they want to drop bombs on them. And I think there is an unbelievable amount of distrust, and perhaps very difficult for Americans to understand, given that, we all love this country and we think the best of it, that our motives are not seen in any sense as pure, and no matter how pure they may seem to us or how pure they may be, other people are not going to see it that way. So I think the question of international legitimacy for this operation is one that I certainly wouldn't discount. But my other question to you was, in terms of the Bush Doctrine, what do you mean here? Because my understanding was that the Bush Doctrine is, you strike before, you strike a threat before that they have the chance to strike you. And I think we're both agreed here that Libya didn't actually present a national security danger to the United States.
Well, if you're trying to catch me in a Sarah,
no, I'm not trying to Palin test you. I remember you wrote a post about this earlier this week where you said, if you think Bush was bad, let's try Bush light. But I can't remember exactly what you said when you said you had your definition of what the Bush Doctrine meant in this context, and I just wanted you to clarify that because I can't remember exactly what you wrote.
Yeah, basically, to me, the Bush Doctrine always meant the national security strategy outlined in the 2002 National Security Strategy, which is an occasional document that presidential administrations put out, unclassified, and certainly preemption or prevent. And then there's also a distinction between preemption and prevention, which is momentous, as it turns out, is a piece of that. But that's not all that was. All that was there. It was, the idea was that the successful prosecution of the war on terror depends on a culture of democracy and liberal institutions developing in the Middle East over the short, medium, and long term. That means different things, but it was proactive more broadly than it was just preemptive or preventive, and this is a bit wonky, but the distinction between acting preventatively to stop an imminent national security threat and acting preemptively in a way where the causal chain was still was still fairly early on in the line, but you can foresee possibilities unfolding where if a situation is allowed to go unchecked, there could, arise a national security threat to the United States. I know that's hopelessly general, but the point is that I never saw the Bush Doctrine or that kind of aggressive American foreign policy as being strictly about stopping impending national security threats. It was more proactive than that. It was about using diplomatic and military muscle abroad in a way that prevented those threats from becoming imminent. And of course, that gets more both operationally and morally and politically dicey the further away from imminent threat you get. But I never understood the Bush Doctrine to be just about stopping the ticking time bomb scenarios. I don't know if that answers your question.
I mean, I guess the reason why the situation in Egypt was so wonderful and inspiring was because you're talking about a peaceful transfer of power.
Right.
I'm one of the reasons I'm skeptical about getting involved in a country's civil war is that once the transfer of power is conditional on the use of force, I think it's actually very difficult to then base a society on institutions that that support the peaceful transfer of power. And this is, I think, I forget who said this. I think it was Mark Goldberg, but right after, the 2008 election, someone said, there was a conversation where someone said something like, in Africa, we need more leaders like Obama. And someone was like, well, actually, we need more leaders like McCain. And what they meant by that was more people who step down when it's their time to step down. As soon as the Libyan, the issue in Libya became violent, that's when I immediately, stopped being very optimistic about what the outcome there was going to be. Because we just, once you have a situation where it's about who has more guns and who has bigger guns, then, it's very difficult to move on for that. I mean, the United States is somewhat unique in the sense that, we created a democracy out of, a violent revolution. I mean,
yeah, and they called it when John Adams, peacefully stepped aside when Thomas Jefferson beat him. They called it the Revolution of 1800.
Right.
At the time, it was somewhat remarkable that this had happened. So, yeah.
Exactly. I mean that kind of institution building was going to be needed in Libya regardless of what happened. So It's not, again, any kind of involvement here was going to be a much larger commitment than I think anybody, including the administration, wanted to publicly admit. And that's part of my problem with it. The other thing is, we don't do this very well because it's very hard. And we don't, it is remarkably hard. And I think we forget sometimes when we talk about this because of the way we talk about the use of force and because we live in a country where very functional political institutions are given, we forget how hard it is to create them from scratch.
I think that's right. Now, I mean, I'd consider myself, and I've said this, and I said it in the post you referenced earlier. I'm a reformed interventionist in the Bush Doctrine mold, but there is, I mean, like I said, it's so easy to fall into bad habits because I thought that there was a humanitarian need that coincided with a national security interest to stop this kind of indiscriminate slaughter, right? So, I would want that mission to be limited, but it's of course so easy for there to be this mission creep and for that to spiral out of control. And even, just having casual conversations around here, you start to hear yourself say things like, well, if only we could get some weapons to the rebels, then they could take care of this. And you don't even realize what you're saying, I mean, it's amazing how short our memories are. Or, I joked just the other day in a conversation around the office that what we need to develop are weapons that we can turn on and off remotely.
Like the sort of Judge Dredd things? Like where
exactly, yeah. that we can just, from the Pentagon, we can just push a kill switch so that we won't be having American Stinger missiles fired at us 20 years after we, ship them to Afghanistan. But, I mean, on a serious note, too, I heard somebody say, that the real problem with the rebel army is that it's disorganized. It lacks organization. And it's not that they lack the will to fight. It's just they need a command structure and they need a battle plan. If only we could send in a few advisors, And again, people don't realize what they're saying.
Right.
I mean, people don't realize that, people don't have short memories. I mean, Vietnam, and I wasn't even alive, and I hear advisors, and my alarm bells start to ring. So I mean, I agree with you that this is not something that we're good at. It's really, really hard.
Yeah.
But they pulled this war, they pulled this intervention in a few different places, and there's generally been broad support for the no-fly zone as it stands, and broad opposition to the potential. Say again?
To a lengthy commitment.
To a lengthy commitment, or to the commitment of ground troops at all. I mean, there's a huge aversion to that, and that's sort of exactly what we'd expect. I said the other day that everyone's a neocon on the first day of a new war. everyone's we tend to be, as Americans, I think, really, and I don't think it speaks to a, it doesn't speak to some sort of evil militarism, but I think we tend to be optimistic about our engagement abroad, because I think, as you put it, we think we're operating from the right motives.
Mm-hmm.
But so I lost my train of thought there. But you're right. It's a hard thing to do nation building, and we have to remember that and be modest. And if we could keep the when I thought we could keep the scope of this engagement sufficiently limited and the mission clearly defined, it was one thing. But now I just think it's sort of already spiraling quickly out of control.
Well, speaking of spiraling differently out of control, I read a post of yours the other day that I thought was pretty interesting. You were talking about Red Dawn, which is, of course, one of my. Red Dawn is a movie that I think. Did you ever read that blog post that was talking about uncomfortable movie summaries? And I think the uncomfortable movie summary for Red Dawn is a highly motivated, a professional military is no match for a highly motivated insurgency.
Right.
Which I thought was poignant. But of course, it's being remade, but it's being remade in some sort of really weird, terrible way, and you were pretty upset about it.
Yeah, I was. I mean, I knew that the Red Dawn remake was happening, and I was intrigued by it and open-minded about it. I didn't know too many of the details. I knew that the Chinese were going to be the bad guys this time around. And then there came news a couple of weeks ago that the studio, I think it's Paramount, I don't want to slander them, but I think it's Paramount, is going to recut it and digitally excise most or all references to communist China as the bad guys, and in most and what they're going to do instead is it's going to be, so they're not completely weaning out. I found out reading more into this. What they're going to do instead is make the bad guys a confederacy of communist nations, and the most prominently featured of which is going to be North Korea, which, as I pointed out in that blog post, is just absolutely absurd that Kim Jong-il would wake up and decide it was a good idea to send a couple 100,000 of his starving, desperate soldiers to America.
Right.
One of my colleagues here, Kevin Williamson, said as soon as they tasted their first Slurpee, they'd put down their rifles. And so I don't have to spell it out. I think anyone who's watching this can understand how absurd an idea it would be for a large-scale invasion by the North Koreans of the United States. But what was interesting, since I wrote that post, I've had a lot of conversations about this, and I've certain people have prevailed upon me to a limited extent that really what we're looking at is capitalism in motion, and we shouldn't be afraid of this. After all, these movie companies have to market this stuff internationally, and why not? Why would you want to alienate such a huge market, not just on this project? But on future projects, and in case folks out there didn't get the point, the Chinese were excised from this because the studios were afraid about how it would affect future business interactions with Chinese distributors. And so fine, that makes sense. And also, this is the other thing is this is Hollywood. We routinely suspend disbelief. It's either a good popcorn action flick or it's not a good popcorn action flick, and that's all there is to it. But one thing there was a kind of delicious irony the more I learned about the plot, reading into it on the remake, is that in the remake, the Chinese show up to collect a debt, right? And their propaganda machine. I've seen stills from the movie and some early reviews from people who saw the old cut, and their propaganda campaign is, Soviet realist style propaganda posters, hammers and sickles, factories, and they say things like helping you, China helping you on your feet, getting your economy going again, and so I thought that's kind of interesting. I mean, it's a little silly and a little absurd, but that's kind of interesting. That's a hook that kind of gets into me, and I just there's a kind of delicious irony, of course, that the studios are so worried about Chinese financial ramifications of making these guys the bad guys, that they're excising them from this movie. When in the film they're here to collect on our debt. But you said when I wrote that post that this was because the hook of that post was the awfulness of the Red Dawn remake is evidence that we need a Red Dawn remake. And what I meant there was that that we needed a kind of I was looking for through Hollywood a kind of cheap source of patriotism, not jingoism but patriotism. And you responded something like, well, it's evidence to me that it's going to be a bad movie, which but you wouldn't go beyond that. So I take it from that you are not a big fan of the original, or at least to be remade.
I think that Red Dawn is a movie for its time, right? I mean, like, I put Red Dawn in the same category as like Rocky IV, right? You know what I mean? This is the sort of movie that is meant to show the cultural superiority of the United States and capitalism in comparison to the Soviet Union. And, those movies were of their time. Like, it wouldn't make sense to remake Rocky IV and have, like, the Chinese Communist Party standing up and clapping for Rocky at the end. Like, we're not in that kind of civilizational struggle with China. Like, in a way, like, their economic reforms have already sort of conceded the point that Soviets, that kind of communism doesn't work. And in fact, we're so not the kind of epic existential threats to each other that the U.S. and the Soviet Union were, that, the movie's being changed because we don't want to mess up our money with China. You know what I mean? We want to be able to sell them stuff. And I mean, like, that sort of, that's a sign of the fact that we're just not the enemies. We're just not enemies with China the way we were enemies with the Soviet Union. And China just is not as scary as the Soviet Union once was. They're just not that kind of a threat. Like, I think if we're going to have some kind of nationalist propaganda, I mean, I think the best nationalist propaganda idea I think I've heard recently was a couple of years ago, when I think Frank Miller was going to do a Batman comic in which Batman goes after Al Qaeda, which I was like, that's awesome, that's fantastic. That's that's something for our time. I mean, right now America is engaged in a struggle against Al Qaeda and its affiliates, but there was a time where I think a Soviet land invasion of the United States wasn't a completely crazy idea, but there is no country we're afraid of invading us now. I mean, we're the world's last remaining superpower, at least for the moment. There's nobody who can stand against us. So I just think that kind of film wouldn't have that kind of resonance. I mean, I think what you want is not necessarily a Red Dawn remake, but something of that sort of quality that is more sort of aptly tuned to the nationalist tendencies of our time.
No, that's a fair point. But I would say that and the threat of China is a much bigger topic. What kind of threat China poses to us is a much bigger topic. But I would say that we can be in a struggle with China that's civilizational without being existential. Mm-hmm. So you're right. I don't think anyone's really worried that it's going to be us or them in the purest life and death terms, in purest life and death terms. But there is, I think, still a struggle there between two systems, and I think that the fact that the genius of the Chinese is that they were studying the failure of the Soviet Union very closely during and after. Right. They sent fleets of social scientists and economists to the collapsing and collapsed Soviet Union to figure out what went wrong there, and they convinced they wanted to be sure that they weren't going to make the same mistakes. So the genius of China is that they are, or it looks like the genius of China now. Historical scale might tell a different story, but the genius of China was that they were trying to do just enough differently from the Soviet Union to survive, to ensure the survival of one party rule. And so I think they get away with a lot because they've engaged the Chinese kind of plutocrats and the ruling class present, one face to the world, and they're excellent trading partners, and they always, honor the terms of their contracts, and they fully embrace, and they provide cheap products, and they fully embraced, global capitalism. But there's a danger of whitewashing what goes on between the borders there, and the fact that politically, and in terms of civil society, and in terms of human rights and all other sorts of things, environment. If you care about the environment, they're the worst offenders there are. So there's a danger of whitewashing them. But to go back to your point about what Red Dawn was, I mean, I would agree with you about Rocky IV. I mean, Rocky IV is kind of absurd, but still, a feel good, patriotic or nationalistic movie. I think Red Dawn, the original, was actually a little bit more interesting than that.
Well, it was grittier, that's for sure.
It was grittier, but it had the involvement of John Milius, who I'm a big fan of, who's this kind of, people often call him one of the few. They call him a conservative auteur, He's if I'm not mistaken, isn't he involved in Game of Thrones? Do you know if that's right?
I don't know if that's the case. That would be very interesting. I'm very much looking forward to Game of Thrones. Are you a fan of Game of Thrones?
I'm a huge fan of Game of Thrones.
Okay, we may have to talk about that then.
We can go down that rabbit hole in just a second. But John Milius is a really interesting character. He did Conan the Barbarian and Q Laugh Track. But Conan's another one of those movies that's a stupid, muscle-bound, swords and horses action flick, but also has some really interesting stuff in it. And Milius wrote the script, and he's kind of his cultural world is triangulated, I think, by Genghis Khan, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Charles Bronson or something. Clint Eastwood. So he has these really interesting points of reference. But in the original Red Dawn, people said, "Oh, this is jingoism, and it's America, F yeah," that sort of thing. But if you think about the arc of that movie and what the lesson was, it's we get invaded. Nobody likes us enough to help us out. A bunch of kids have to basically lose their souls and their humanity and turn into terrorists to resist it, and everybody dies anyway. Right? So I mean, I didn't see this as a particularly triumphal movie, and I think that's one of the things that makes it interesting. Is that I thought it was patriotic, and it was kind of an argument for the American way, but it wasn't blithely optimistic one. And so, in a way that makes kind of the sting of changing the new one, for the benefit of the Chinese market a little bit sharper, because, we kind of, like I said, the great thing, there was kind of a moment of in this kind of Reagan moment in which Red Dawn, the original Red Dawn came out. I thought it's a pretty bleak movie, and not just gritty, but it's pessimistic. I mean, there's kind of a glimmer of hope at the end, the epilogue.
Well, right. Well, I mean, we win. The U.S. wins the war because of the Wolverines, right? I mean, ultimately.
But not because of the Wolverines; they're all dead.
Well, right. They're all dead.
The Wolverines were. I think they were supposed to be emblematic of a broader resistance that eventually overcame. But as I recall, and I haven't seen the movie in a few years, but as I recall, the sort of closing title cards say something like, "Eventually this war ended," like other wars. But it said something like that. Eventually this war ended. It didn't say eventually we crushed those commie bastards. And so it was, I thought it was really ambiguous and interesting. And to see, this new one just. Yeah, I don't think John Milius is the kind of guy who compromises his vision very easily, and this one, it seems, is just much more. I mean, it's a standard complaint about Hollywood movies is that they are focus grouped and screen tested to death, so that they provide something for everybody and everything for nobody. But I think this is a particularly deliciously ironic instance of that.
So, I just to shift gears here a little bit, but still stay within the context of geeky political nerd culture. I actually just wrote a piece on Game of Thrones as sort of the anti-neocon fantasy series, and I did this sort of premise.
That's intriguing.
I did this sort of premise on, I remember National Review a couple of years ago did this thing where it's like the top 25 conservative movies, and it named Lord of the Rings, right? And Lord of the Rings actually is, and I sort of understood why people embraced that at the time. It was coming out sort of right before the Iraq War on 9/11, and it was sort of a very Manichean struggle. You're sort of fighting monsters, and it's the good guys are very clear and the bad guys are very bad. But Game of Thrones strikes me as a world that is like almost like The Wire in its moral ambiguity. Like there are, it's actually not very easy to tell who the good guys are and who the bad guys are, and in fact, it's left. I mean, so much of what's happening and is left sort of ambiguous because of the shifting perspective. Like you're not really sure. I think that one of the more amazing moments in the book, for me at least, is where you sort of get the impression that the original rebellion, Game of Thrones takes place after the kind of epic war that you see in Lord of the Rings. The good guys have already won, and there's a point in the book where they sort of suggest that actually the war, the previous rebellion in Game of Thrones that happens before the books happen, which was sort of premised on the idea that the prince had, raped this. One of the relatives of another one of the main characters in the book, that maybe that relationship is actually consensual and that the war was fought almost entirely on false pretenses. Right. And I just and even just the fact that, in the aftermath of the war, rather than a sort of long peaceful reign of the new king, you have a power vacuum that devolves into like a brutal slaughter. It's like it fractures like post-war Iraq. You know what I mean? Like there's no, all these factions suddenly start fighting each other to the death, and there's actually, the post-rebellion peace doesn't last very long at all. I mean, I'm curious to hear what you think about that.
That's certainly an intriguing hypothesis, and I do think that.
Not to say that he's partisan. I mean, I don't think that you can boil either one of those movies down, or Game of Thrones or Lord of the Rings down into sort of like a political platform, but just sort of as a world of sort of moral ambiguity. I think Game of Thrones appeals to liberals in that way.
Well, I'll tell you, I'm not this is just going to be some kind of autobiographical reporting. I'm not much of a Tolkien fan. I mean, I'm sort of a Tolkien fan in the abstract, but that's to say I'm not much of a fantasy fan. I've never been drawn into. Me neither, actually. This is the first one that I really. This is the first fantasy series that I actually very, very like. Same deal with me, and I think this session can serve as a ringing endorsement for this series of books. Although I wish they had called the show A Song of Ice and Fire, which is what the series of which A Game of Thrones is the first book is a part of. It's the only. I read the first Lord of the Rings. I read The Hobbit when I was a kid, and I read Fellowship of the Rings to my girlfriend at the time when she was recovering from surgery. I read it to her, but that's the only Tolkien I read, and I was not drawn into it in any real way. This, from page 1 on of this series by George R.R. Martin is the author of the books, and they're turning it into an HBO show. For those of you who are completely lost,
sorry, I should have prefaced that better.
From the first page of book 1 of that series, it's clear that he's the anti-Tolkien, and the politics and the politics of the book. What I love about the book is how little magic there is in it. Right? There's very little. There are no elves on quests.
Right.
There are no swords that heal people, or there are a couple dragons, but even the dragons, for the bulk of the characters in the series, take on this kind of they're semi-mythical because they're far off. People don't really know if they ever existed. They don't, most of the people who are around have never seen one. Blah blah blah. But the politics of these books are real politic to the core.
Right, yeah. I mean, they're very much political thrillers.
Yeah, absolutely. And very little magic. More, it's really just kind of sex and power struggle, and that makes it really interesting. So, I mean, I wouldn't know. I'm trying to think of when the first book came out to see.
It was mid-90s, I think.
Okay, so you're not suggesting that there was any actual real cause.
Oh, no. I just mean in the sense that, in the same sense that, Tolkien happened, the Tolkien movies came out at a time when America was in this, very sort of, we're in a war, we're entering the war on terror, gung ho, yeah. These sort of speak to an era in which Americans are much more skeptical of military intervention, as we just discussed earlier. I mean, and just that they reflect, I think, a moral universe that is far more complicated than the one that Tolkien created. Although, of course, Tolkien practically invented the genre, so I mean, it would have been weird if he was also, other people are Martin is doing something with a kind of genre that Tolkien helped create. So I don't mean to say, I don't mean to, for all the Tolkien fans out there, I don't mean to hate entirely. But I mean, even there's just, I just find the books fascinating precisely because, like, when you look at something like The Wire, I mean, you never think to yourself the cops are the good guys, the drug dealers are the bad guys. You're very much more concerned in these social situations, with the social situations that sort of cause people to act the way they act, their obligations, and you think to yourself, what would a good person do in that situation, and would I have been a good person? And I think that's what I sort of like about the books, is that these people are all sort of muddling through in a system that is, extremely unforgiving. Whether you're, a serf or a nobleman, you're equally confined by the system that you exist in.
Right, and I think that's right. And just from a storytelling perspective, one of the things that I think that's great about the books is it can as you said, there's a lot of moral ambiguity, and there are certain bright, white, shining heroes and certain purely evil villains, but most people occupy this kind of middle space, and more interestingly, they shift.
Right.
They move through the course of the book. People you absolutely despise in the first book, you really start to root for by the third book.
Right.
And what's amazing is you have these different sort of factions with wildly different motives who are sworn enemies of each other, and their whole goal is to eliminate the other faction, and yet you find yourself rooting for elements
of both sides
in both camps, in a way that's not really commensurable, and that's really interesting. And also, just one last thing that struck me as you were talking about, that The Wire does so well, and that these books do so well, is the complete and utter lack of sentimentality at killing people's favorite characters.
Right.
Right? Because
anything that can happen must happen. Like it
exactly, yeah.
I mean,
total Murphy's Law.
Yeah, Murphy's Law. I mean, if you think someone is going to die because you can't see any way for them to escape, chances are they're going to die. There's nobody running in to save them at the last minute. For the most part, they are, what you see is what you get. And the problem really, and what's brilliant about the books, is you don't always see everything. And he does a really good job of making sure that you learn that the hard way.
Yeah, he almost seems like he's punishing his readers at some points, but read the books. I hope the show's halfway decent.
Yes, me too.
And do you know are they going to do one book a season, or they're not really thinking that far ahead?
My understanding is that it's one book a season. I believe that I interpreted calling the series Game of Thrones a sort of a belief that a sort of maybe a hedged bet that maybe it wouldn't survive past its first season. But if it's as good as HBO has other stuff HBO has produced, I think it's going to be pretty successful. And I think it starts in April 17th, I think is the date.
Well, we really are. We're the PR team for HBO.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully they actually sent me some swag a little while ago for posting on it. Hopefully they'll send me more.
Awesome.
But I guess we're getting sort of towards the end here.
Should we try and talk about something relevant to what we do for a living?
Well, we could. I think what I suggested earlier was we should talk about the 2012 GOP nominating contest, which I think is getting really weird. I mean, if I were to pick people who I thought would probably be good Republican nominees, I'd probably say, just in general, I'd probably say Barber, Daniels, and Pawlenty. And yet I see people like, or Romney, and I see people like, Bachmann's running now. I see Trump, throwing himself all over the place, trying to get attention. Some of these people, I'm actually weirded out that they still have any support. I mean, I think the knives are out for Palin, and I'm not sure if she's actually going to run. But I mean, you probably know more about that than me.
Well, I don't think, just to run down those lists, I don't think Palin will run, and that's as much a gut thing as I mean, various reasons, things I've been told on and off the record, not by Palin, just to make clear, but things I've been told on and off the record by people around her, make me think that she's not going to run. Mitch Daniels, I don't think is going to run. I just think I don't think he wants the hassle, frankly. Mm-hmm. And I think each successive answer he gives, I mean, I always thought that Mitch Daniels' game was kind of, and this applies to a lot of the other candidates actually, Mitch Daniels' game was just, let me take advantage of the buzz surrounding the idea that I might run to sort of make some statements about what I believe and push my policy agenda, not just in Indiana, but, believe it or not, to have a positive effect on the political conversation in the country. Mm-hmm. I think, and I actually think that's kind of what motivates him. And I think that, even a guy like, a more marginal guy like Chris Christie, who I've spent a lot of time covering, who's made just absolutely clear he's not going to run for president, it doesn't mean he still doesn't enjoy the benefits of the buzz that creates mm-hmm. around him, and the fact that people, will take, and places like the National Review will take your policies, in New Jersey a little bit more seriously, and bring them into the national spotlight a little bit more if they think there's some outside shot that you might be a Republican presidential contender. And I think what Michelle Bachmann is doing, and this is not based on anything I've heard from her people or from her herself, but I think what she's probably thinking is that she's got nothing to lose mm-hmm. by running. It just raises her national stature. It gives her a shot at making her case, making this kind of Tea Party case, and perhaps in coloring. I mean, I think the best thing she could probably do is pull the rest of the candidates a little bit to the right, or something that would be more lasting than that, because we all know that candidates run to their base in the primary and to the center in a general. Something that would be more lasting than that is to fire up the Tea Party and reveal to the rest of the Republican field that this is a serious constituency that you have to pay attention to, and that they're not going to just sort of let you off the hook. So I think that's probably what Bachmann's trying to do. I don't think I wouldn't think that she thinks she can win.
But aren't you worried that she's going to, hurt the more policy-oriented candidates? I mean, don't you think that someone like Barber, who isn't, contrary to some of the press he's gotten, isn't really much of a culture war guy, and
right.
I mean, I mean, maybe not Daniels, since you don't think Daniels is going to run, but some of these guys who, could actually be, decent Republican presidents. I mean, doesn't someone like Bachmann hurt them by making them force them to sort of play a completely different game?
You mean hurt them in a general?
Well, hurt them in the sense that she makes
just make them less appealing.
She makes them less appealing
for liberals.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't think she makes them less appealing for liberals. I mean, there's only so far right you can go before you start pissing off everybody in the middle. And I think someone like Bachmann is appealing to conservatives, but I don't think she, the way she talks about things, isn't something that appeals very much to people outside a certain segment of the Republican Party.
Well, I don't know who it's going to. I mean, I think that the Bachmann, and it's not just about Michelle Bachmann; it's about what she represents. But I think that the Tea Party factor, as embodied by her nascent candidacy, the people that affects most are the Palentis and the Romneys of the world. I mean, and I think those two guys are probably the front runners, but I think it certainly affects the way they talk about issues, for good or for ill. I don't know. I think so much rhetoric during presidential campaigns is noise, and the media, the narrative becomes, a handful of the narrative gets shaped fairly early, and I think you can. Not to dog whistle is such a loaded term, but I think you can talk to your base ad nauseum, using saying all the right things and using this inflammatory political rhetoric and this rah fire up the base stuff. And it doesn't really. I mean, I think that's just a lot of that just ends up being noise in the general. So I'm not especially worried that she'll she'll hurt their credibility with the middle. A guy like Barber is an interesting case. I think you're right that he's not a culture warrior, but and he's a super sharp guy, and you're right, he's a policy minded guy. But I think he gets he's got a lot of issues. He's kind of gets painted as being the worst of both worlds, when in fact he might be the best. What I mean by that is that he's got the kind of policy mind of a guy like Mitch Daniels, and yet what I think people see is he's got this kind of round Southern white guy, with a thick good old boy accent thing, and I think that's really going to hurt him, because he's not that guy, and he's not even going to, and he's not a culture warrior, so he's not even going to appeal to the cultural conservatives, but he still has this sort of albatross hanging around his neck. I think he's really challenged. He's the most challenged optically candidate, I think, on the right, but he's also a really well qualified candidate who's an excellent political operator and a really strong policy guy. So if anyone can kind of overcome he said it himself. He was on Meet the Press or Face the Nation or something a month ago, and he said, I'm a triple threat or a trifecta. I'm a lawyer, a lobbyist, and a politician. So I think he knows how kind of the cards are stacked against him as an establishment a guy and a good old boy. But if anyone can overcome it, he can.
I think I think along with Daniels, he's probably the least frightening to me as a candidate. And take that with a grain of salt. But I just think I think someone like Bachmann or Palin would be pretty catastrophic as president. I don't think Pawlenty. I don't think Barber or Daniels would be. I think they're people who obviously did decent jobs of running their states, and have a lot more to them than just than what I think. Than the sort of culture war stuff that it seems like Palin and Bachmann excel at. But I don't know if that helps them too much.
I wouldn't know how to game that one out. But I think the interesting thing to me about the primary as it's shaped up so far, the Republican field is shaped up so far, is I think it's exactly what it looks like. I think there's a lot of ink being spilled, suggesting that this is there's all these wild cards and anything could happen, or who knows what it's going to look like in the air. No, I think that it's Pawlenty and it's Romney, and
I think you're probably right about that.
And if I don't think. But again, that's because I don't think Mitch Daniels is going to run. That's because I don't think Sarah Palin's going to run. If those things do happen, then maybe it gets more interesting. But I really think it's exactly what it looks like at this point, and it's probably Romney, frankly. But it's the one kind of wild card I see is Barber, because he's kind of one of those unassuming politicians who gets a lot out of the fact that he was underestimated.
Well, he's got a lot of favors to call in too.
Exactly. Yeah.
He's the interesting thing about Barber as like a president is I wonder how much goodwill he'd have in his own party. I don't think a lot. Barack Obama. I don't think a lot of people owed Barack Obama much coming into office. You know what I mean? But Barber, everybody in the party owes Barber, which is I think probably another reason why he's underestimated.
Right. Yeah. So I do think if anyone can overcome, the knocks that he has against him, it's him, because he's such a sharp operator. So he'll be interesting to watch, and I think he certainly thinks he can win, or he wouldn't be getting involved. So it's going to be a heck of a ride for the next year or so.
All right. Well, I guess we're sort of getting to the close here. I guess we should probably wrap this up. But once again, it's always great to butt heads.
Absolutely.
And I guess I'll see you next time.
Okay, Adam. Have a good day.
Take care.